Welcome to this episode of Moments in Leadership. First, I'm sorry for not getting an episode out in September. I just had some personal stuff come up that required both my attention and a lot of travel that I was not expecting. So I was away from all this for a while. Anyway, thanks to my Supercast subscribers for understanding. I know you support this project and expect something to come out every month, and I do strive for that. Okay, so I've got some great guests coming up in the queue for recording, but if you can make me an introduction to a guest, please do it. Just email me at themilloffice@gmail.com. Or you can direct message me on my Instagram account, which is at @themilloffice. And I get a lot of messages that are like, hey, you should get so-and-so on. And those are great. But without a warm intro, it's just tough for me to pull it off. I can't just cold call people without email addresses or phone numbers or anything like that. So if you can recommend somebody and put me in touch with them, that's the best way to help. Real quick, thank you to my two newest Supercast supporters. I've got Bo Glenn at the Buy Me a Beer level and First Lieutenant Joshua Heller at the Hot Wash level. Lieutenant Heller, good luck finishing up with law school and TBS. Okay, as always, thanks to all of my Supercast subscribers. Without you, I just can't get this done. I'm about halfway to breaking even on what this cost me, so I really appreciate it. And if you want to learn how to support the project, just jump over to the show notes or in any of my social media accounts and hit the link for a Supercast sign up. I really appreciate it. Okay, with that, this episode is with retired Lieutenant Colonel Isaac G. Lee, his call sign Whiskey, and he's the author of Hangar 4, which is a memoir of a combat aviator and a CH-53 pilot. And look, I read this book cover to cover, and then after, I passed it along to an active duty infantry captain and company commander because of the leadership lessons in the book. So, passing along a book written by an aviator to an infantry captain should tell you something. But while I think this book is great for any emerging leader to read, look, if you're a current captain and you're getting ready to promote to major and you're moving out of that group of people who sit around bitching about majors and moving into becoming a major, I think there are just some great perspectives that are contained in the pages of this book, and you should definitely be reading it for no other reason than that. Okay, Lieutenant Colonel Isaac Lee was raised in Lubbock, Texas, and then he graduated from Texas Tech University in May of 1996. Go get 'em, Red Raiders. Okay, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in August of 1997, and then he was designated a naval aviator in March of 2000. And then in April of 2000, he reported to Marine Heavy Helicopter Training Squadron 302 at Marine Corps Air Station New River, North Carolina for training in the CH-53 Super Stallion. And then in December of 2000, he reported to Marine Heavy Helicopter Squadron 465, Marine Aircraft Group 16 at Marine Corps Air Station Miramar, California. From there, he deployed with HMH 465 to Okinawa, Japan from June of 01 until January of 02, and then Operation Iraqi Freedom, OIF, from January of 03 to June of 03. And then to Operation Iraqi Freedom 2 from October of 03 to March of 04. Then upon return from OIF 2, he attended Weapons and Tactics Instructor, or WTI course, in the fall of 2004. He then deployed to Operation Iraqi Freedom 4-6 from March of 05 to October of 05, and then in May of 06, he reported to Marine Aviation Weapons and Tactics Squadron 1, or otherwise known as MOTS 1, out in Yuma, Arizona. After MOTS 1, he attended and graduated from Command and Staff College in June of 2010, and then he returned to HMH 465 in Miramar. And from there, he served as their operations officer until deploying to Operation Enduring Freedom 11-1 with HMH 461 from January 2011 to August of 11. And during the deployment, he served as the detachment officer in charge for 153 Marines from HMH 465 and as the operations officer for the combined squadron. And for more color on that, read the book. He goes into great detail about integrating the two squadrons together, and we talk about it a little bit in this podcast too. So it's definitely an interesting part of his career. And then upon return from that deployment, he served as HMH 465 executive officer. And then the following spring, he was the detachment OIC for the HMH 465 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit from June of 12 to December of 12. Then in May of 2013, he reported to Headquarters Marine Corps Aviation Plans, Policies, and Budget Branch until he was slated for command and then rejoined MAG 16 in 2013, where he served as the Headquarters Squadron Commanding Officer and Manpower Officer. And then he took command of HMH 462 in November of 2014. And under his leadership, the heavy haulers, as they're known, deployed to Okinawa, Japan in support of a UDP and the 31st MEU. HMH 462 was recognized as the 3rd MAW Heavy Helicopter Squadron of the Year in 2015. And then in May of 16, he relinquished command of HMH 462 and joined the 3rd MAW staff in his final billet as the Deputy G3/5 Operations and Plans Officer. Lieutenant Colonel Lee retired from active duty in August of 2017. Okay, Lieutenant Colonel Lee has over 2,900 hours of mishap-free flying and has held every instructor qualification and flight leadership designation in the CH-53 Echo. His personal decorations include the Meritorious Service Medal with 3 gold stars, an Air Medal Individual Action with a Combat V and Gold numeral 2, the Air Medal Strike Flight with numeral 17, Navy Marine Corps Commendation Medal with 2 gold stars, and the Navy Marine Corps Achievement Medal. He's married to the former Carrie Smith of Centerville, Virginia, and he has 2 children, a daughter, Tristan, and a son, Dalton. And with that, welcome, retired Lieutenant Colonel Isaac Lee, call sign Whiskey 53 pilot, and author of Hangar 4, which is an incredible book. I know we're going to talk about it a little bit, but I read it cover to cover. I actually had my highlighter out for it a lot of times, and just a fantastic book. And so it's exciting to have you on. I also really love when I get pilots to come on because your leadership experience is so unique and different, but important. And it gives such a different perspective on things. So it's really exciting to have you on. I always start the podcast off by asking the question, tell us about, everyone starts out as an O1 or an E1 and, tell us about times. But a lot of that beginning time is you going through flight school and TBS. So I do want to ask you the question, because I think it's kind of easy to gloss over, but there must have been some great leadership lessons. What were you like as Second Lieutenant Lee at TBS and flight school? And what were some of those initial lessons you learned just going through the whole pilot training pipeline?
Yeah, of course. Well, first and foremost, thank you for having me. Really excited to be on the show with you today and happy to talk about all of that. I'd say starting with OCS, the best lesson that I learned, and it really was my attitude going in, was I was very aware that I basically knew nothing. So my plan was be very observant of the other candidates around you, figure out who appears to know what's going on, and just do what they're doing. Because if you just do that, that'll keep you off the radar until you yourself kind of figure out what's going on. And just by virtue of luck, because we're in the squad bay, alphabetical order, the 2 guys next to me were Jones and Klosterman. Jones was a Citadel graduate that went on to be a colonel. Klosterman was a prior enlisted infantry marine. But those 2 guys were squared away from day one. So for about the first, I would say 2-3 weeks of OCS, I was just mimicking what they were doing. And that kept me off the radar while I was quickly learning and adapting to the environment. And I ended up doing pretty well. But I credit the fact that I was intelligent enough to just do that. I wasn't going rogue. I wasn't kind of alone in my head trying to figure it out. I was just like, what are these 2 guys in the rack next to me doing? And that actually worked out very well for me. And then I quickly learned that it really was just going to come down to work ethic. I was never going to be the smartest, fastest, strongest lieutenant. I felt like I was pretty middle of the pack in all those regards. But if I just worked like literally as hard as I could work, I figured I would be okay. And that formula really carried the day for me in flight school. My peers and friends used to literally make fun of me for how much I studied and tell me I was paranoid. But I kind of looked at it like, well, if I work as hard as I possibly can, then if I don't make it, I at least will have no regrets. I won't look back and say, damn, you should have worked a little harder or you should have tried harder. And that really helped me a ton getting through flight school, and actually did well in flight school as a result of that. But like you said, you have this thing in aviation where you're in training for 3 years before you ever get to the fleet. So you have almost like this delayed bit of your development. By the time you're in a fleet squadron and interacting with, call them real fleet, fleet Marines, your peers who had ground MOSs, they've already been doing that for, 2.5 years. I made some quick observations when I finally did get to the fleet in December 2000. So it was about 3.5 years had passed since I got out of OCS. But The first one was really just understanding that in a squadron specifically, it's really all about the maintenance department. And you can have the greatest operational plan in the world, the greatest ops team in the world, but it doesn't matter if you don't have aircraft to fly. And I quickly picked up a couple of mentors in squadron. One was a major who was our maintenance officer, Brad Brown, who was awesome. And another was a chief warrant officer named John Pfeiffer, who was our avionics officer, but had grown up as an enlisted avionicsman and became a crew chief. And those two guys were extremely knowledgeable and were just great people and kind of took me under their wing and really helped me understand early that it was all about putting those Marines downstairs in maintenance in a position to be successful. And that's what made the squadron work. And I learned a lot, not just from them, but by really connecting with the junior enlisted Marines downstairs. And so about a year later, I got picked to be our squadron flight line officer, which is similar to being a platoon commander. At that point, I'm a junior captain, but I had 70 Marines and actually a handful of staff NCOs that technically worked for me. But I really approached those guys with, I'm working for you, you're not working for me. And I learned so much from those staff NCOs and NCOs in the flight line division during that time that really formed the officer that I ultimately became and continued to be throughout the rest of my career. But I give all those Marines a lot of credit for helping me figure those things out. I would say a couple other lessons I learned pretty early in the fleet, and one was just an observation, was, I was a 53 pilot at Miramar. Hangar 4 was home to the 53 squadrons, and we have 4 squadrons there. And after about 2 or 3 rotations, I realized that at any given time, one squadron's awesome, 2 are mediocre, and 1's terrible. Despite the fact that the playing field is perfectly level, right? Everyone has the same aircraft, same part supply, same number of Marines, same quals. But at any given time, one squadron was really thriving, a couple were just okay, and one was really struggling. And it didn't take me too long to figure out that it was actually the squadron leadership that was the X factor. It was every time there was a change of command, it was a wild card. Is that squadron going to get better? Are they going to just maintain? Are they going to, fall off the table? And once I recognized that pattern, I went back to just being the observant person that I was and started really paying attention to what are they doing over there that's working? What are they doing in that squadron that's not? And just those observations and free lessons and watching other people do it really helped me a ton when I became more senior.
Yeah, you said before that when you went down to the maintenance department as a junior captain and you were really connecting with the Marines. Talk a little bit more about how you actually did that, because coming from the ground side, like you said, you're a brand new second lieutenant. You get out of MOS school. I got out of artillery school, and boom, I'm standing in front of a platoon. And so I learned fast, or not faster, but earlier on in my career. And then you come in, but you've been in flight school and all of these training pipelines for 2 years. Like, you were starting essentially at the same base point as a second lieutenant. What were some of those lessons that you learned about how do you actually connect with those Marines when they have MOSs that are very, very specific in the maintenance community and you're a pilot? Where's the connection there?
Yeah, well, I looked at it this way, and I never came off of this. It was all about earning the trust and respect of the other Marines in the squadron, and I really put the onus to do that on myself. And that went both up and down the chain, right? Like, I had to earn the trust and respect of my fellow aviators, the senior pilots in the squadron, obviously the field grade and the CO. But I did the same thing in reverse down the chain with our enlisted Marines. And the way I went about that, I always thought of it as there's 3 components to it. One is competence. Like, you have to at least demonstrate that you kind of know what you're doing, and demonstrate that you're working your butt off to know as much as you can, to be as effective as you can. The second component was just, human 101, caring about them, like just making some kind of human connection. And obviously, you're an officer, they're enlisted. We all understand how those relationships work in an appropriate way. But I always took time to get to know the Marines at least as much as I could. So it was, hey, how's your mom doing? How's your favorite football team? Those small little human interactions with them really was helpful in establishing that trust with them. And then the last piece is just, confidence. No one's going to follow anybody that's not confident. But obviously, you don't ever want to take that too far and cross the line over into arrogance, because you can go from very effective to completely ineffective quickly if you do that. So it was kind of those 3 components that I was always really focused on. Like, hey, I'm here working for you. I'm going to work at least as hard as you are. I'm going to learn everything I can about what you're doing so I can help put you in a position to be successful. I care about you. And yeah, I'm confident. We're going to get this done together, and we're all in this together. And that was very helpful for me.
So the preview to the movie is you must have been successful, because I don't think unsuccessful people become squadron commanders. So there's the preview to the movie for everybody that's listening to this. But but let's dig in a little bit on it, because
it worked okay.
Yeah. So clearly there were success stories there with your leadership in the department as a young officer. What were some of your failures there? Or said differently, what were some of the things that you'd like take a do-over on?
Well, there weren't a whole lot of things I would say I really wanted to take a do-over on. Anytime, and I give credit to those staff NCOs that I was down there with for really trusting me and me trusting them. But anytime I started to say stray off the path, they did not hesitate to quickly grab me and say like, "Hey, sir, we probably don't want to do that, and here's why." And I always took that advice on board. So establishing that good relationship with them, I think, really kept me from ever doing anything in particular that I was like, "Oh, damn, I wish I had that one back," or "Oh, damn, there's a do-over." I would have done those things, but I had a good enough relationship with those staff NCOs that they prevented it really from ever happening.
Yeah. That's interesting. I just don't have any context for the aviation community, but then there's also the fact that your squadron is incredibly officer heavy. Was that dynamic always at work
It
from
was.
standpoint of leadership? And talk about that a little bit.
A little bit, but I would say something else that I recognized early about the squadron, and this remained true for my vantage point throughout my career, was, you've got 300, 350 Marines in a CH-53 squadron, and yeah, about 30 of those are officers, most of whom are aviators. But really and truly, everyone is kind of trying out for the team. So as a junior officer in a squadron, you're kind of nobody until you pick up some qualifications in the aircraft, which is a unique dynamic. You're not commanding anything, you're not in charge of anything. You are very much trying out for the team, and all 300 and some odd Marines in the squadron understand that. But what I recognized was, in every squadron I was ever in, there were probably 10 or 12 Marines that were really like the key players in the squadron that were making everything work. And those 10 or 12 Marines, it wasn't necessarily tied to rank, billet, or particular MOS, right? So hopefully the commanding officer was one of them, but not always. Hopefully one or two majors was in that group, but not always. And then you had usually a few senior captains that were part of that, definitely a few senior staff non-commissioned officers, and always a couple of NCOs. And that group, once you identified those 10 to 12 Marines in the squadron, they were the ones that were really making everything happen. And you could tell that the other 300, 350 Marines, they were following those people.
Okay.
And that really was an interesting thing to watch.
Okay. I'm a craps player. Not that I gamble a ton, but when I go to Vegas, I like playing craps, right? And so there's some rules, like you never say the word 7 out loud or anything like that, right? So I don't know if I'm gonna like say some things that should never be said in the aviation community. So you got to give me some width here on this. But
of course,
in the aviation community, you've got generally captains, right? I mean, I know there's some first lieutenants, but
yep.
And you were just saying that a lot of that, to become a player in the squadron, you've got to get your qualifications. So it's not just about, hey, he's a good stick. And he's got these or she's got these qualifications. And that starts to create, I would imagine, in the officer ranks, some separation between us and them. That may not be the right way to say it, but there tends to be. Is there a lot of like leadership challenges there? As I'm going to ask you to fast forward to your major time, or maybe even your squadron commander time, where like you're looking at these captains and is it like Hunger Games to, like, between these captains to get all the quals to, like, because it's not like in an artillery battalion, it's just lineal standards. Like, who's the senior lieutenant, and the whole thing triangles down from there. But in your world, like, it's a box. It's not really a triangle.
It is. It's a very unique thing to naval aviation. Obviously, Marine Corps aviation is you've got rank, you've got billet, and then you've got qualifications in the aircraft. And so in the aircraft, when you first get to the fleet, you're a co-pilot. You're nobody. It takes about a year to go through a syllabus to become an aircraft commander, where you can sign for the aircraft. And that is the first big wicket where you've proven, like, okay, you're competent, you can be here, you're really on the team now. But there's another dozen qualifications beyond that, and qualifications, flight leadership designations that you can earn. But in every peer group that checks into a squadron, which is just generically say 10 officers, 10 check in as co-pilots. 3 years later, one, maybe two of them will have achieved every qualification, the uppermost being graduating from WTI, or Weapons and Tactics Instructors course out at MOTS 1 in Yuma, Arizona. Most of them will end up being kind of mid-level qualification wise. They can lead a flight of two during the day. They can do functional check flights on aircraft, things like that. But it's not so much Hunger Games, but it's interesting too, because not everyone wants all of those qualifications because it's a lot of work and comes with a tremendous amount of responsibility. But that does naturally start to separate that peer group over the course of their time in the squadron together, as far as who's doing what. And that also plays into what ground job, we call them, you get, like your actual job that you're doing outside of flying. So that's really how it just sort of naturally starts to separate over time. But once that group of co-pilots is initially in their syllabus and start going through it, that separation starts naturally occurring just based on who's able to keep up, who's able to be advanced through the syllabus faster. And it's really preparation, and then it just comes down to how you perform in the aircraft that starts to shake that out.
Right. So if you're a new officer in a squadron, every time you get into that helicopter and take off, everything you're doing is being judged by somebody else in that aircraft. And then there's some after action.
Yes.
And then it's like, hey, Armstrong's ready for this. Or, hey, no way, dude. I mean, I'm never going up with him again, which is probably what they would all say about me. But so that's weird because from my perspective, coming out of the ground community, is we don't really have those kind of things. There's schools that you go to, but it's foreign to me to hear that there are people who work so hard to become Marine officers, work so hard to become pilots, and then all of a sudden this separation starts to take place because you're not wanting to get those quals, is what I think I heard you say, or you're not good enough to get those quals, and there starts to be this separation. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it is not set up for everyone to get every qualification. It's just physically impossible just based on the amount of flight time that's available to go around. So every squadron at any given time has what's called a standardization board. And that's typically made up of the commanding officer, the field grade, the majors, who you typically have like, say, 4 or 5 of those in the squadron, and then a couple of your most senior captains. And once a month, they sit down and go through every name of every pilot and aircrew in the squadron, talk about how they're doing, recommend them for the next qualification. Hey, is this pilot ready for the next one? Yes, no. And that really determines how quickly people start to advance and that separation happens. But it was interesting. You're 100% correct. Like every day is a graded event. Every flight is a graded event. You are constantly being evaluated on your performance, and that determines all of that in those really your first couple of years in the squadron.
Yeah. Now flashing back to let's just say your first squadron, right? And you're a captain, you're getting all those quals. Any times where you had a bad flight or something that really kind of shook your confidence or just got into your head a little bit? And what did you do to overcome that? Because somebody listening to this is going to have a bad flight someday as a new officer and going to have to figure it out.
For sure. There were definitely a couple of times where, and I just happened to be someone who got advanced through the syllabus pretty quickly for a variety of reasons. But, I was demonstrating that I could do it. So they'll feed you as fast as you can consume it, essentially. But I had a couple of training flights where I was really kind of flying through the syllabus. And this is, say, between my first and second deployment. I ultimately did 4 in my first fleet tour, which was unusual, but the war happened. And so that's why that happened. But between that first and second deployment, I was getting pushed through several syllabi simultaneously. And I definitely had a couple of flights that didn't go great. And I was very aware that I was probably out over my skis a little bit. I was probably being pushed a little quicker than I was totally ready to absorb. But in those cases, the pilots, the senior pilots I was flying with, they didn't back down and they didn't back off of me. The debrief was like, hey, yeah, we're a little ahead of where you're ready for right now, but you're very close. So just keep doing what you're doing. And, another couple of reps and it'll start coming together for you. And so they were confident in me. That helped me keep going. And ultimately I was able to do everything they asked me to do and get those qualifications.
Yeah, that's interesting. So what sort of advice do you have for leaders who are in the position where they judge and formally evaluate others who've actually made a mistake. Because I think in your community, mistakes are much more black and white. I don't mean like crashing or not crashing. I just mean like you see the
Of
performance
course.
and the error, right? So I think one of the things that is challenging for new officers is to figure out, like, first of all, how to allow yourself to be formally evaluated and not take it personally. Right? I think that's a really hard skill. It was hard for me. Somebody told me I didn't do something right. It ruined my week. Still does, by the way.
Yeah.
Never really came over that. But anyway, so as somebody who is formally evaluating pilots, when do you let something go? When do you chalk it up to a learning experience? When do you formally counsel them? When do you sort of like, at what point are you saying like, that's so egregious that it can't just be like, hey, do better next time? Because I think you see that a lot more in the aviation community than maybe we do on the ground side.
You do. And I think you actually learn it in flight school, because in flight school, everything's an evaluation there too, right? So you're on the receiving end of that for a few years before you even get to the fleet. So you get used to how this process, if you will, works. But for any instructor pilot that's teaching and evaluating, it really always came down to safety of flight. They're going to make mistakes. Sometimes they're going to be behind the aircraft. They're going to have a hard time with their situational awareness up to a certain point where they can actually absorb the obscene amount of information that's happening in and around that aircraft. So it's to be expected along the way. But as long as they're not doing anything that's a real safety of flight issue that comes down to lack of preparation or just a complete lack of situational awareness that makes you start to believe this person just can't do this, then they're okay. You just keep dusting them off and putting them back out there. And the instructor is really sitting there to keep them out of trouble, keep it from going sideways.
Yeah. Again, I come back to this. It's so hard to become a Marine officer. It's so hard to become a pilot. And then you end up in a squadron and then you're just not performing. Do you have some stories that could be instructive to emerging leaders who are in the aviation community or leading in the aviation community about where you saw people just flat out fail? I mean, they go through all that training. They know how to fly the 53, but then they just fail.
It happens in aviation. There are people who get all the way through flight school, earn their wings, get to the fleet squadron, and just can't make that last jump to the varsity and all that's required of a fleet aviator. I mean, there's a process for that, but the squadron will work with that aviator for quite a while before it gets to a point that they initiate the formal process of reassigning them to another MOS. And there are those Marines out there, and I know some of them, and they were all good people, good Marines, and they were all working their butts off. They just didn't quite have the intangibles, if you will, that set them up for success as an aviator. And many of them go on to be very successful in whatever ground MOS they get assigned to after that. I mean, the slang term for them is fallen angels, because they're walking around out there with wings, even though they're not flying anymore. But good people, good Marines, and we're able to go plug back in somewhere else in the organization and be useful.
I have this question I like to ask. You can answer it from the perspective of your captain time, your major time, your lieutenant colonel time, or you can tell a story about all three. But one, if not more, of the best lessons you ever learned from your worst leader.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I would say the one thing I learned from a few leaders that I felt were particularly not great was just really the KISS principle: keep it simple, stupid. A lot of times, what I observed was that people in senior leadership positions in the squadron, and so I'll just generically say, when I'm a smart ass young captain, the field grade, would make things just too damn complicated. And at the end of the day, we need to be able to go out and execute whatever this plan is. And so I observed over time that those leaders who were making things more complicated than they needed to be, those units were struggling as a result. Or I came to believe personally that was the reason. And that really got confirmed for me when I was advancing through my qualifications, got selected to go to MOTS 1 as a student to try to earn my WTI qualification. And you go there, kind of my expectation was this is going to be super complex and super complicated. We're going to do all these big complicated missions, and it's going to be extremely, it's just complex. But what I quickly learned and what they taught us at MOTS 1 was the art in this is taking a complex problem and then coming up with a simple solution that your squadron can execute. Because it has to be simple enough that your Joe average pilot who's flying the Dash 4 aircraft needs to be able to do it. And that made a ton of sense to me and really reaffirmed that principle. So from that point forward, for sure, anytime someone senior to me was coming up with a plan that was overly complicated, I was definitely one to speak up and say, "Hey, sir, I think we need to dumb this down a little bit. Here's a way we can do it. Here's why. If we dumb this down a little, make it simple, we'll be successful. But if it's too complicated, this isn't going to go well."
Yeah, it's interesting because this topic came up and ultimately became a question that I like to ask when I was out talking to some aviators in a squadron. And what I noticed from talking to them was that young officers, and I'm going to pick on the O3s, right? I'm going to pick on the captains a little bit. So toughen up, guys, if you're listening. All right. But they seem to, and by the way, I went through this struggle too. So I'm not like saying, oh, everyone else but me. No, I mean, I went through this struggle too, where you think you know everything, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So they seem to go through these struggles where they think they know everything, but they also worry about and criticize everything except their own performance, right? And again, I was guilty of that too. And I think true professionals are the early adopters of mastering their own authority while focusing inward on their individual proficiencies and performance and less about all of the things they can't control. And I'm just curious if you have any advice for the young leaders to help them overcome that tendency based on the fact that you made it through that period of time in your life and then you became a squadron commander.
I did make it through, and I will freely admit that I was certainly a challenging captain to lead because I was 100% in that group, especially just due to my timing. I got my qualifications quickly. I did a couple of combat deployments pretty early. I was fairly convinced I was 10 feet tall and bulletproof and had it all figured out. I would say the thing that helped me at least sort of stay in the box, or at least not get too far outside there where I did anything that was too egregious, was that I had a good peer group and we all really kind of kept each other in check. So even though I had more quals than say some of my peers, they still didn't hesitate to kind of reel me back in when I needed to be reeled back in. And I also credit some of the field grade officers that I had for that too. Like, there were certainly times when I got a little bit too out over my skis and got checked by those guys, but they always did it in a way that hammered home the point. I got the message, but it was, no real damage was done per se, right? Like an appropriate ass chewing here and there was helpful to kind of remind me like, hey man, you're not there yet. I mean, as much as you might think, there's still a lot, you still have a long way to go. So keep growing and just keep working. And that was super helpful to me for sure. And I was always very receptive to any input that I got from anybody at any level when I always just figured if someone's telling you that you need to do something better or how you're doing this isn't the right way to do it, you should probably listen. And I always did. I was receptive.
Yeah. You made a comment in the book that I really appreciated about your commanding officer in Afghanistan, where you said it was easy for us to critique how he handled things since we weren't doing his job. And I feel like that's a typical junior officer perspective on things. And then that perspective always seems to change when you get older, right? Like, so when I got towards retirement,
Absolutely.
right. And I'd look at it and be like, oh, these captains, God, right. But then I was one of them and I was right in their chair and I'm now friends with some of my people who I was lieutenants with now have kids that are in the Marines. And I hear them talk about some of the things that they think are a big deal where they're complaining about. I'm like, God, did I sound like that? And then you try to tell them, you're like, it's really just not that big of a deal. But I'm curious because when I read that part of the book, you were a major in that squadron. I don't remember your billet, but you were definitely a major, I think, right?
Yeah, I was the operations officer in the
That's
squadron.
Right. And I'm curious if there was ever times where you and the other field grades got together and say like, hey, listen, we need to grab the captains, get them into a room and start talking to them about piping down a little bit or giving them some perspective on things like, were you a buffer between them and the CO? For people who haven't read the book, the reason that was unique was because you had these two mishmash. I'm sorry, I'm going to go off here in a second, but you made this really great point in the book. What infantry battalion in the world would take 3 companies and put them together and then ship them off to combat? Like, insane, but.
Yeah. It was a very difficult situation for that reason because it was this mishmash squadron from 2 opposite coasts. But yes, I definitely was a buffer in that unit, which is kind of how it worked out. And I was the operations officer. I'd also just come from being an instructor at Marine Aviation Weapons and Tactics Squadron 1. So I had about as much credibility, if you will, as I was ever going to have at that point in my career. And so I just kind of naturally became that person. And I was also the dead OIC from the West Coast contingent that was working for this commanding officer from the East Coast. And I'll say, like, he's a great individual. I love the guy. And by the end of the deployment, like, it was good. It was a great experience. But that initial couple of months was really difficult as we were mashing that together. The stress was extreme. Everything coming down from higher was difficult. And I certainly had to spend a fair amount of time talking to the captains and really doing as much as I could to be a buffer in that, to really massage the relationship for the squadron as a whole. And it took us about 2 months. And then we had a big mission that came up that really turned into a catalyst for all of it coming together. And we were fortunate that we got that opportunity. But from there, it clicked and it worked. But those initial couple of months were definitely a challenge, and probably one of the greatest leadership challenges I've ever had, because it was just such a non-standard situation to work through.
Right. I'm curious, again, not a whole lot of context here, but I got to imagine the aviation community, it's hard to, I'm just going to make up an example out of the maintenance section. You're a pilot, right? And you're the officer in the maintenance section, but they're such, I mean, I don't know if you would know as a pilot how to fix anything on that aircraft from a mechanical perspective, but you're in charge. And you probably lack the ability to walk up to the maintenance chief on any particular system on the aircraft and say, "Oh yeah, that's the Svetzer valve. You just need some 3-in-1 oil and some gauze pads to fix that," right? For those of you who get that movie reference, I hope there's a few.
Yeah.
But it's your responsibility to say yes and no to things that this incredibly authoritative and experienced Marine is telling you, do this, do that. And so I'm curious if you have some stories about the first time you had to put your foot down and say no. And maybe it wasn't in the maintenance section, could have just been with another, or even in the middle of a flight or something like that. But I think the first time, or maybe not even the first time, every time you have to say no as an officer, there is some sort of inkling of self-doubt that enters before you say no. Whether you express it or not, it lives in your head. And I think that sometimes when you have to say no, isn't really coming at a time where you can think it through, especially in an aircraft, right? So I'm wondering if you can share some stories to help young leaders prepare for that situation.
I have a couple. So the first one I'll say, and staying on the maintenance reference, and I mentioned earlier, that earning that trust and respect was a combination of competence, caring, and confidence. But competence to me was, I really took seriously that it was my responsibility to learn as much about that aircraft as I possibly could. I needed to understand the systems as well as was humanly possible, knowing that I was never going to know as much about the avionics system as an avionicsman or about an engine as a flightliner, but I needed to know enough to have very intelligent conversations with them and be able to at least offer a perspective on things. And I put in a ton of time in my first year in the squadron making sure that I did that. I did a ton of walkarounds with, a warrant officer that we had that was just a great guy, great teacher, to make sure I had the systems down pretty cold. And then I became a functional check pilot who would go out and literally test aircraft after maintenance procedures were done. And I remember distinctly being a pretty junior functional check pilot, and I had a very senior quality assurance staff NCO that was out there making some engine adjustments with me. And he told me what he was going to do. And I totally disagreed with him. And I was like, no, we need to do, X, not Y. And he got a little bit fired up about it, but we just shut down the aircraft and got out and had a conversation. He asked for a third opinion, who agreed with me. And then that was that. And we went back and made the next adjustment and kept going. But I remember thinking that was at a point in my career where it was kind of a big moment where, like, okay, like I know enough that I'm actually useful and helpful and have intelligent conversations with these experts to make sure we're doing the right thing for the machine, as we're working on it. And that was great. Another one I'll share is on my third deployment to Iraq. I was a senior captain, and in our ready room, which is literally the room in the squadron where all the officers get together to plan and brief flights, debrief flights. And we also have what we call all officer meetings in there, AOMs. One night, we'd had a couple of aircraft get retasked in flight to do something different than what that was originally planned. And, knowing what I know now, it really stressed our commanding officer out because he thought those crews were going to go one thing and they ended up doing something that was a lot more, say, dangerous, high speed, however you want to phrase it. So he got us all together in the ready room and essentially said, hey, from now on, if you get retasked in flight, you need to call back here, call back to base and let me know. And then I'll tell you whether you can do it or not. And in that moment, I remember, excitable Captain Lee, I just piped up and said, hey, sir, sorry, but it doesn't work that way. When we take off, we're working for the battle captain. Your job's to provide up aircraft and qualified crews. And, we think we know what the plan is when we take off, but we're not working for you anymore after that. After that, things changed. The battlefield's dynamic. And if we get retasked, we get retasked. And it was kind of a ballsy thing for me to say in front of everyone the way that I did, and it was definitely out over my skis a little bit. But I felt like I was right, and I didn't want to try to install some procedure, if you will, in the squadron that was going to delay something out there in a dynamic environment and cause us to be late for something that our Marines on the ground that we're supporting needed. So that led to a follow-on discussion, and I give him a lot of credit. He handled it great, but at the end of the day, we didn't do it.
Yeah.
It's not how it works.
You tell a similar story in the book about you got out a little over your skis at a Kangaroo Court. You kind of posted up to the squadron commander, and it's not clear in the book, but I assume that it was in the Kangaroo Court is probably anybody who doesn't know what that is can just, the name says it all, right? I'm assuming. So
yeah.
But you made a comment where you said, "Oh, you're fucking crazy" or something like that to the CO, and you say like the whole room went silent, and that prompted a follow-on conversation with the CO too. But what I underlined in the book about that specific story was that you didn't get into it, which is why I'm asking the question. You alluded to the fact that you got smacked around a little bit and got your ass chewed, but that also there was there must have been some sort of reconciliation. And I'm wondering if there was a learning point there, or was that lesson formative for you when you then eventually became a squadron commander?
Absolutely. I mean, I certainly was always, especially as a company grade officer, I wasn't easy to lead. I did everything 1,000 miles an hour. I went hard 24 hours a day, whatever we were doing. I could be a bit of a handful, but I give those COs a lot of credit for how they managed me, how they led me, how they shaped me. And I definitely got beat up every now and then. In that case for the Kangaroo Court, certainly. But, it was a dumbass comment to make. Of course, it definitely, even in a ridiculous scenario like a K court, which is just ridiculous in its own right, it still was something I definitely shouldn't have done. He was pretty hard on me in a conversation, but that was really it, And then he always just brought it back to like, hey man, we need you. We need the best version of you. Don't be a dumbass. Get back in there and do what we need you to do. And to be honest, every time that happened, and it happened a few times, I came out of those conversations very motivated, very dedicated to the squadron, and really felt like, okay, yeah, he's right. I owe him and I owe the squadron better than that. And I always found it to be kind of a charge in a positive way, to be honest with you. It was helpful. And he and I had a couple of those. That he was the same individual, that I just told the story about in the ready room in Iraq, same guy. And he and I had a couple of those. And it was funny, true story. After the book came out, I just sent him a note one day and I was like, hey, sir, I was looking back on this book's out. And I wrote the whole book from the perspective that I had at the time. No revisionist history, didn't change anything. Even in instances where I now know like, oh yeah, you were being an idiot or you look like a jerk. I left it that way because I wanted to depict this is how it really was. This is the situational awareness I had at the time. This is what I said. This is what I did, even if I was wrong. I sent him a note and just said, "Hey, sorry, I know I was kind of a handful." And he just sent me a really nice note back. And he's like, "Oh, you were definitely a handful." He's like, "But you were one of my favorite Marines, and you always did exactly what we needed for the squadron. So I always wanted to, basically approach it that way with you." And I appreciated that. And to this day, we have a great relationship. And I consider him a friend.
Yeah. You basically answered a question that I generally ask about Mavericks, because I'm always fascinated by the Maverick scenario in the
Yeah.
military, right? Because we have movies made with people literally named Maverick, and we revere the character, but then in real life, sometimes that's a colossal pain in the ass to have that person in your command. But at the end of the day, there's such a benefit to it. And every leader at every level, whether you're a sergeant in an infantry squad or a commanding officer of a regiment or a wing group, anything like that, you're going to have your Mavericks, and they're going to be people that you rely on, and they're going to be people that just drive you nuts.
Yeah.
But there has to be some sort of skill as a leader to manage those people. And you just hit on it. I want to highlight it because what you said, it just resonated with me so much. You said, like, when somebody told you, "Hey, you're a valued member of this unit and we need the best version of yourself." When I got out of line, when people said some version of that to me, it brought me back to center so fast. And I was never even bitter when they said it, because I was kind of a maverick. I was a pain in the ass. That's a great story, because I think it's very helpful to people who are like, how do I manage these maverick type leaders? Because everybody's going to have them. And I'm wondering if you have any more stories like that.
Yeah, well, and I would say in general, I didn't totally realize this till probably about halfway through my career when I was a major. And then once I saw it, it made sense. But my observation over time was that we had Marines, and again, it wasn't specific to rank or MOS, but the way I'll say it is this: the Marine that we most needed on the darkest night, on the most difficult flight, was also prone to being a liberty risk. And that was not an accident. Like, those two things were very connected.
Right.
And once I understood that, it was very helpful to me. And honestly, I understood it because I was one of them. And for the first few years, I would get really frustrated with myself and be like, "What are you doing?" Or, why did you do this? Or why did you do that? But then I realized that it was all connected. And I started noticing there were other Marines in the squadron that were similar. And I think of a great historical example, and an extreme one, of course, is Pappy Boyington, right? Like, greatest fighter pilot of all time. But his personal life was a total, a bit of a train wreck, for lack of a better way to put it. The guy was just wild. And so how do you take that personality and tame it enough in the right places at the right time to keep that person in uniform, advancing, doing what you need him to do as a Marine? That's a really dicey thing for any leader to navigate, but you need those guys. Like, those are the guys we most need when the balloon goes up and it's time to go fight. So I was very aware that we needed to cultivate those Marines and handle them and lead them in a way that kept them in a good place, where they weren't getting themselves in like real trouble because the unit needed them. And I was always really borderline there myself as a young captain. But once I realized that, it helped me a ton.
I think the Great Santini is another great example of that kind of a leader.
Yeah,
that movie,
exactly.
that was for
Exactly.
anyone who hasn't seen that movie and you have anything to do with the Marine Corps, especially the aviation community, definitely go out and watch that movie. You'll know exactly what we were talking about. But yeah, a guy with this huge messed up personal life, but then, revered as a fighter pilot, but then liberty risk, and always in the middle of the liberty risk kind of stuff. Earlier in our conversation, you talked about the dynamic of there being ranks and then billets and then qualifications in the aviation community. And that's really distinctly different from the ground community, and must create some sort of leadership dynamics that are unique to your community. I'm wondering if you can spend a few minutes talking about that and the uniqueness of those three things from a leadership perspective.
Of course, it does create an interesting dynamic, because in every squadron you have, standard rank, your typical triangle, the billets that those individuals are in, and then qualifications in the aircraft. But those qualifications in the aircraft mean a lot. So when you're talking about just the day-to-day running of the squadron, your typical structure, if you will, rank and billets is leading the squadron. But when you start talking about executing actual missions, flying the aircraft, then the qualifications in the aircraft are the thing that become the most important. And so you have these scenarios in every squadron where you have senior captains who are weapons and tactics instructors, in many cases have more qualifications in the aircraft than the majors and lieutenant colonel who are leading the squadron. Not in all cases, but in some. And so you have this dynamic in your squadron ready room where you're planning and, planning flights, going out to execute flights, and everyone is defaulting to the person in the flight that has the most qualifications or is leading the flight. And that does create some interesting leadership moments. And fortunately for me, I was a weapons and tactics instructor as a captain, so I had to learn how to get those senior officers essentially on board, if you will, sometimes with what my plan was, what we needed to execute. But it also created some interesting conversations with higher headquarters at times, because we would go up to brief the group commander, or in some cases the commanding general, on some plan we were putting together for a big tactical mission. And those individuals would be looking at me as the company grade captain WTI and asking me the questions, where I might have a major lieutenant colonel sitting next to me who was technically my boss or my bosses, but it was really my plan. And the general wanted to know what I thought. And I always thought that was probably a challenging thing for those senior officers to be in that position. But we had a good relationship. They trusted me. They let me do that job. And so I was always cognizant of that later. And even though as a major and then ultimately as squadron CO, I had every qualification, so I wasn't in that same position, I really tried to let those junior officers that had the qualifications be in charge of those things and not interfere. And of course, I was paying attention to what they were doing and looking at their overall plan. But if what they were doing made sense, I didn't interject at all. I just let them do it because they needed to get that same experience.
How often does that happen where a commanding general is being briefed by a captain? The captain has more experience in quals than the CG does. I guess that happens.
Yeah, and of course the general has, in most cases, those general, for especially in aviation, the generals for the most part probably had a lot of qualifications in the aircraft, and they're extremely seasoned aviators. So it's a little unique, but in aviation, everyone really honors that the person who's leading this mission has the most qualifications. It's their baby. And so, you'll get some input obviously from those more senior officers, but for the most part, it's your responsibility, and they let you run with it, which is pretty neat.
Yeah. Over your career, and I know that's also from your book, I'm sure you have other examples too, but you saw, and we discussed this earlier, you saw not only pilots fail just as aviators, but you probably saw other leaders fail. And I know from the book that you had a commanding officer that was relieved while you were in a squadron. Can you recount any traits that typically derail leaders or cause them to fail? They could be, I've had answers sound like risk aversion or ego. And did you see any differences between failure that happens at a junior rank versus a senior rank?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there were the two consistent things I saw that led people to fail were risk aversion was absolutely one of them, where they just were so risk averse that they started really trying to reel everything in, which is a very difficult thing to do as a leader, especially in the Marine Corps, especially in combat, and even more so probably in aviation, because it's just an inherently dangerous thing that you're doing, right? You can operational risk management every mission to death, but at the end of the day, there's still a fair amount of risk that's being accepted when those crews take off to go fly. And so trying to harness that, put their arms around it, I really saw leaders struggle and not do well in attempting to do that. And I also observed that when they were doing that, the natural tendency of Marines is to be aggressive, right? Like to play to win. Like you can't win if you're worried about losing. And so leaders like that tended to get disconnected from the Marines they were trying to lead for that reason, because the Marines they really almost need the opposite, right? Marines, you should be like kind of pulling the leash back just a little, but you really want them to run and go be aggressive and go be Marines and do those things. And I always felt like the more you try to keep them from doing that, the harder they're going to pull in the other direction. And so it generally didn't go well for those leaders who tried to do that. But I think it also became more amplified the more senior they were. So you can have a junior captain who's kind of risk averse, and the rest of the squadron is just going to pull that individual along, for lack of a better way to put it. They're not going to be in a position to really kind of stem the tide. But the more senior officers that were that way were more challenging for the rest of the squadron to work through and work around. And it would create a challenging dynamic at times when that happened. The other thing that's a little more obvious for, where I saw leaders really struggle and in some cases fail was just frankly being a little too outside the box, a little too bold, like almost the exact opposite, right? But not necessarily even in the mission, just being super bold outside of the mission and things they were saying and doing, and in and around the squadron, or decisions they would make regarding how we're going to function on a day-to-day basis. And in a lot of cases, just your standard Marine Corps jackassery, right? Like just being too far outside the box on liberty or in your spare time or whatever was kind of the other extreme end of the spectrum.
Yeah, that's kind of that's the natural. If you ask somebody to imagine somebody failing, it's that. But I got to imagine in the aviation community, and really a lot of different communities, but we're talking specifically about the aviation community, is this, is risk aversion or risk assumption. Can we talk a little bit more about how you led people who were risk averse and how you led people who were, like you said, outside the box, or maybe assumed a little bit too much risk for for your comfort?
Yeah, for sure. In both cases are unique, but those that were risk averse, or when I realized that they were a little more risk averse and they were junior to me, and I was in an instructor position where I'm flying with these people and trying to teach them and trying to develop them. Fortunately for me, I had a lot of combat experience early in my career that I could lean into to use as examples for them. And the thing I would always come back to really as my primary teaching point was just to remind them, like, hey, go back to OCS and TBS, where they started teaching us about, the OODA loop and our decision process. And really that being successful out here in the battle space is going to be about having a clear thought process. And that OODA loop has to be running like 1,000,000 miles an hour. And if you're risk averse, there's an emotion associated with that. And it's typically, call it anxiety or fear, that you start feeling. And that anxiety and fear will actually slow down and cloud your thought process. And that in of itself will get you in trouble. Like the thing you most need to take care of yourself, this aircraft and the Marines we're supporting, is to have that clear thought process, to think fast, to make decisions quickly. And that was always what I would lean into with them. Like it's okay to be a little nervous. It's okay to be a little scared. That's normal. But don't let that make you so risk averse that you're just sitting there and you're this little ball of emotion inside of your head and you can't think, because that will get you killed. That will get other Marines killed. And that was always a very easy way to make that point to them and help them understand, to bring that out. But on the other end of the spectrum, for those Marines that tended to be pushing it, so to speak, and you could tell were possibly, or maybe even likely, going to get themselves into a bad spot and trouble at some point, I had done enough borderline things as a young officer that I always just used myself as an example and said, hey, like, I see what you're doing. I understand why you're doing it. I'm wired the same way. But I would just tell them stories about things I had done. And the point I always tried to make was, I'm still here doing what I'm doing because of how other people who were senior to me decided to handle me and lead me. But I am very aware that I put my fate in their hands, and that's something you don't want to do. Don't put your fate in anyone else's hands. And if you get too far outside of this box, that will be exactly what you do. And I was fortunate in that the few times I did that, I lived to fight another day, so to speak. But it was not my decision. I put someone else in the position to make that determination on my behalf. And fortunately for me, the couple of times I did it, it worked out. And I usually learned a very good lesson from it and got better at it as a result. But that was always my message to those other Marines that I saw doing something similar.
Yeah, interesting. There's that saying there, but by the grace of God walk I. And I've got to imagine that you've got some specific examples of that coming out of your community. I'd love to hear if there were any moments in your career where you either saw that and you said to yourself, geez, I'm never going to do that. And then as a follow-up question, I want to talk about that moment in your book where you had another captain in the aircraft with you and you flew through a storm, and at the end of the flight he basically decided he didn't want to be an aviator
Yeah.
anymore.
Yeah. And actually those two would go hand in hand. So I would say in our community, the thing that I started seeing, and frankly, it happened on the very first night of Iraqi freedom, was what we called CFIT, controlled flight into terrain. And what would happen in the aircraft, typically a night flight, and the lower the light level condition, meaning no moon, it's dark as dark. So even with night vision goggles, you can barely see anything. If there was not a discernible horizon, it was very disorienting and it was very difficult to fly. And we lost aircraft over the course of 20 years of combat for controlled flight into terrain, where the pilots just became disoriented to the point that they frankly flew a perfectly good aircraft into the ground, and there's no survivors when that happens. So I saw that happen a few times over the course of my first 3 deployments to Iraq, and I was very aware of it. And I had several moments where I was flying and knew that I too was literally in that situation in that moment, and had to really lean into my training to make sure that, we got through it. But that night that you're talking about, where we ended up flying through that Iraqi haboob, which is essentially a giant dust storm that's typically about 1,000 feet tall. We couldn't see it coming because it was at night. We were on night vision goggles. It was low light level. There was no light to amplify. So we were just flying along as a flight of 2. And then next thing you know, we were in it. And as soon as we were in that storm, I knew what it was. I understood the situation. And it was definitely a white knuckle event getting that on those aircraft back to the field. But we did. We managed to get back to Al Asad safely. And absolutely, as soon as that flight was over, I understood exactly what had happened. I felt very fortunate to be standing there, but I was flying with a more junior pilot, and right away he was just like, you know what, like, I'm not doing this ever again. Like, that was insane. In the moment, I really didn't think he was serious. I understood that it had scared him pretty good. And that was a very fair reaction for him to have, especially as a more junior aviator. But he was serious, and he ended up, I think he flew a few more flights, not many, and then ended up just standing duty for the rest of deployment. And we got home. He elected to go, transition to a ground MOS, and went on to have a very good career. But it was a great example of, it's an extreme way to live. It's an extreme occupation, and it was very dicey at times. And I understood that it wasn't for everybody, for sure.
Yeah, I read that story. Of course, I don't know him and I wasn't there or anything. But when I read that story, one of the things I took away from that was the fact that that took a lot of courage for him to say, I don't think I could get back into an aircraft and do that again and put people, because my personality, I'd probably try to white knuckle it or something, and maybe even be more of a risk to the community than just saying I'm not up for this anymore.
Absolutely.
I kind of took that away from it.
Yeah, absolutely. I give him a ton of credit for that too. And frankly, the entire squadron did. Like, there was zero ill will from anyone about that. And it was actually a level of respect for the reason you just noted. It was, I think everyone was like, okay, hey, thanks. Thanks for, having the guts to speak up and say something, because that is better than being out there and just not being in the appropriate headspace that the rest of your aircrew needs you to be in to do this. So yeah, I was proud of him for doing it. I mean, as odd as that might sound, great guy. Still friends with him to this day.
Yeah. So you have, I think you said 7 total deployments. I know a lot of them were into Iraq and Afghanistan, and then some of them were Okinawa, and I know some 31st MEU, and I loved your reference to the 30th MEU. I'm an alum of the 30th MEU myself. So you've got a tremendous amount of experience across the board in the aviation community. And I want to take a minute to just talk about this idea of like knowing that there's a time and a place for the issuance of a direct order that must be followed immediately. And I don't know what that sounds like in an aircraft was probably something like brake right or something like that, right? Like just
Yep.
do it. And then, especially in a combat situation, it comes to mind, right? Should we be setting the conditions to encourage more collaboration between junior levels of leadership in a unit, not in a combat situation, but when that immediate abeyance of a direct order, it's not time sensitive. Can we do a better job as leaders for setting that sort of climate and providing the useful feedback instead of because I said so? And I asked that question to you specifically because I have a feeling that happens more in the aviation community than it does in the ground community. Just a hunch.
Yeah, absolutely. And 100% yes. I think to the max extent possible, if not collaborative, I at least found a ton of value in always senior officers telling me why. And I really took that on board as a habit that I maintained throughout my career. So in doing that, the way I always thought of it was this: if you're sharing the at least a little bit of the thought process that led to the decision, that doesn't mean the decision's necessarily up for debate or discussion, but you're at least sharing with those junior officers that there was some thought that went into it, and this is what it was. They can then take that information and learn whatever they want from it. They can form whatever opinion they want, but those are all, I always thought of them as free looks for them, so that when they're in that position, they have something to reference. Like, oh, I remember this happened, 5 years ago when I was a captain and Major so and so did this. I didn't really agree with it at the time, but he explained it this way. So now that I'm in that position, I at least understand his perspective, and maybe some of that, if not all of it, I will take on board and execute in a similar fashion. I just always felt there was great education in that. And to the max extent possible, if you can have those collaborative discussions, it's very helpful. And one of the things I'll never forget, it was a great moment, I think, in my career. And it was one of those moments that, was perhaps innocuous, but I was the commanding officer of the squadron, and one of my majors had come into the office, and we were just talking through a couple of things that really didn't have nothing serious. But he stopped and he said, "Hey, sir, can I ask you a question?" I was like, "Yeah, of course." And he said, "How do you make all of these decisions?" He's like, "I watch you, and it seems like you make 100 decisions a day, and you seem to be like completely unfazed by it. You never hesitate. Like, how are you doing that?" And I kind of laughed, and I told him, and I was like, "Well, think about it. When those come up, how do we make those decisions?" I was like, "Typically, you and one or two of the other majors and maybe the sergeant major come into the office, and you say, 'Hey, sir, this is what we've got, and we've got option A, B, or C. We recommend B.' And 90% of the time, my answer is, 'Okay, sounds good. Go do it. But don't forget about these two things,' or something to that effect." But my point to him was, I'm really not making the decisions. You all are. You all are coming up with the solutions. You're presenting me with options. And most of the time, I'm just agreeing with you and saying, "Sounds great. Go do it." I'm here as the commanding officer to be responsible for however it turns out. But
Yeah.
but I'm not sitting here in a vacuum by myself making all these decisions. You guys are the ones doing the work and really putting the thought into it and coming up with the plan. And it was, you could kind of see, it was a really cool moment where the light bulb came on for him, and he was like, "Okay, I get it now." And it was neat, from a leadership perspective, to see that happen. And that's a practice that I continue to this day in the business world. I lead a big team. I have several executives that work for me, and I'm not coming up with very many of those ideas. They are, for the most part. We're having a conversation. They're presenting a plan. They're the experts in their field, not me. And I'm saying, "Sounds good. Go do it." And I'm there to be responsible if it doesn't work, but same. And it's very effective, I think, in helping those other leaders develop.
Yeah, we're definitely going to come back to asking you some questions about your transition out of the military and the lessons learned in the military, how they apply to the civilian world. I'm definitely going to come back to that. But something you said just rang a bell in my head about there's something in the aviation community, and I don't remember the name for it, but it's basically when all the pilots get together and in a very open format talk about each other in terms of like, is that person safe to be flying? I don't know what the term for it is. Am I getting this generally right?
Yeah, so it's called a standardization board, and it's typically not all of the pilots, but there's a group of senior pilots that go through each person line by line, talk about how they're doing in the aircraft, talk about their personal lives.
Mm-hmm.
Everything's on the table as you're determining, who's ready for next qualification, et cetera. But then we also would do some open discussions in all officer meetings where everyone would kind of go around the room in a more open forum with literally all the pilots sitting there
Uh-oh.
and say, "Hey, I've got this going on, or I'm working on that," and in kind of a safe space to ask questions, to confess. We used to jokingly refer to those discussions as cockpit confessions, but it was just a helpful way to share information and lessons learned, and it was non-attribution when we did that, and it was very helpful.
That's fascinating because I have a previous episode with Vice Admiral Bill Mers. He was a submariner, and he tells a story about how they basically, if you messed up as a nuclear qualified sailor on the boat, and you would be taken off the watch bill, and you would have to remediate essentially, and go basically back through a syllabus where you had to go back through all of the stations and re-earn your qualification to be a watch stander because you messed something up. And as he was telling the story, I'm thinking to myself, okay. And then at the end of this story, the person gets a double signed fitness report, and they're done with their career and they're out. And so he said the same thing, which is there's no attribution at the end of it. If you earn your watch qualification standard back, that's it. That's the end of it. And I mean, maybe there's some reputational damage. Maybe it's the face tattoo of the submarine community. I don't know, but I love this whole idea of the non-attribution, because in the artillery community, you shoot out, the battery commander is getting relieved, even if he was at the battalion CP getting a brief from the commanding officer. That's just kind of how it is.
Right.
I think that there's so much benefit to this non-attribution sort of recertification perspective and philosophy that it's interesting to hear that it's happening in the aviation community too. I think there's a lot of other communities that could probably do really, really well with that. I always make the argument that if a section chief on an artillery howitzer shoots out because they put a charge error in and you remediate that sergeant, you've probably just created the safest section chief in the entire artillery community in the United States Marine Corps, if not the United States Army too. But we lose the opportunity to do that in some communities. And I like hearing about the non-attribution thing.
Yeah, it was extremely helpful to do that. And we also, I think in aviation, we're very good about doing that informally. I talked to a fair amount in the book about my deployments to Okinawa. I enjoyed hanging out in the echo chamber, and it was a bit of a party at times. But the real reason I liked it in there, especially as a junior officer, because the senior captains, the majors, they were just being people, and their guards were down. They weren't in character, but they would be telling stories about things they'd screwed up when they were junior officers or, young aircraft commanders. And all of those discussions and stories to me they were free reps. It was free lessons learned. There was so much value in that. And that was why, spending time like that in the squadron with the junior pilots was so important to me as I became more senior, because I knew how much I'd benefited from hearing all those stories and those things when I was young. And I wanted them to have that same opportunity just to share that information. And it is extremely helpful. And I think in the development, especially for junior officers.
Yeah. I just recently had a reconnection with that very topic. I was at the retirement of a friend of mine who we were lieutenants with, and he retired as a 3-star general. And a whole bunch of the folks that we were all lieutenants and junior captains with together were all there. And everybody has gone off and kind of done their own thing over one Marine having a 35-year career. There was 10 of us there who have all gone off and done different things. And we all reconvened for this celebration of his career. And the topic came up. Well, first of all, we all, like you probably do in the echo chamber. And for those of you who haven't read the book, the echo chamber is the name for the bar that existed in Okinawa. Anyway, you have to read the book, but think of it like a bar, I imagine. And we get around and we tell stories, right? Like you all do, like you did in the echo chamber, I'm sure.
Of course.
And the stories are always grounded in somebody up and doing something, right? Which at the time you think is just the most catastrophic thing that could have ever happened to you in your life. And then 30 years later, you're sitting around laughing about it like it was no big deal. But somebody actually made the point. They said, the thing that made our group of officers so unique was that we were ruthlessly accountable to each other as a group. And we were all in different units. We just happened to be buddies from TBS, and then we all just ended up in Pendleton together. And it was the comment just stuck with me because he was so right. I felt like I was more accountable to my group of peers than I was to my commanding officer from a standpoint of like you just said, the standardization board, the non-attribution, the Bravo TV of the aviation community. I can't remember what you call it.
Cockpit confessions.
Cockpit, right? Cockpit confessions. It could be a Bravo show.
For sure.
It was so formative to me too. And that, you hear people talk about the Lieutenant Protective Association and all of that kind of stuff. And I think that's a model of it. But yeah, I think that social aspect of getting together, like you were just discussing in the echo chamber, it is very similar to what I experienced with just this accountability. And it wasn't just professional accountability, it was social accountability too. Like if you were just acting like a jackass in a bar, you were going to hear about it from the guys, probably because you were messing up their chances of, meeting some girl because they were taking care of you, doing something stupid on getting out of the bar. But
of course. But it's really neat how that happens. And something I didn't realize, obviously, until later, because it would have been impossible to know until later. But especially my first squadron, I did 4 deployments. I was there for almost 6 years, which is unusual, but it's just because the war broke out. But we had a really good group of company grade officers. And it was interesting in that, at the time we didn't really know that and didn't totally realize it. But what happened later is in the peer group that I was in, say plus or minus 2 years, I had this exact number in my head at one point, and I can't remember now. Some number between 10 and 12 of us became commanding officers as lieutenant colonels. And so in retrospect, it's easy to look back and say, wow, that was a great group of young captains that we had together in that unit. But I really give a lot of credit to the guys who were just a tad senior to me that really started, call it the tradition of really teaching the peer group behind them and then passing that baton. And we all bought into that and we all pushed each other hard. We worked together really well. It was super competitive. We talked all kinds of shit to each other all the time.
Right.
But it was just a great group of aviators that ultimately all, performed well and went on to be, successful leaders in the organization and the Marine Corps as a whole. But it was really neat to be a part of that, especially looking back on it was really cool. And the other randomly interesting thing about that is that was HMH 465 on the West Coast, but a similar thing happened in HMH 464 on the East Coast at the same time. And so years later, when we were all in command, there was a point where almost every commanding officer in the 53 community had grown up in one of those 2 squadrons. And it was pretty interesting to see that and watch that play out over the course of a few years in the community. But it all traced back to that early OEF, OIF time period when we were company grade, specifically in those 2 squadrons.
You mentioned early on in the episode here that you'd go out to the West Coast and there'd be one really good squadron, a couple mediocre squadron, and one really bad squadron. I may have gotten the ratio wrong there, but if you can reflect back over your career, what was your distribution across those different types of scenarios when you joined or rejoined your squadron after taking your B-billets and doing some other tours?
Yeah. So I would say, that first fleet tour, I was there for 4 deployments and the squadron was really strong throughout, and then stayed that way for one more cycle after I left. And then just by virtue of the way it worked, the squadron that I had been in came out of the deployment cycle for a couple of years, which was always had a negative effect on any unit that got pulled out of the deployment cycle for whatever reason. So I ended up spending 3 years at MOTS 1, then went to command and staff in Quantico. So I had a 4-year break before I came back to the West Coast as a major and went back into the squadron. And I went back to the same squadron that I'd left 4 years prior. And it really wasn't the same place. The effect of having been out of the deployment rotation for quite a while was very evident in just the demeanor of the Marines, the aircraft readiness. And it really wasn't anyone's fault per se. It was really circumstantial. But interestingly, as I was checking back in as a major, there were quite a few staff NCOs checking back in who had left as NCOs around the same time I had. And so we kind of cobbled together this core group that had been there before and knew what right looked like. And so together we were able to really kind of get it going back in the right direction quickly. And we didn't have much time because we had a 6-month timeline until we were going to deploy to Afghanistan with an East Coast unit. We were going to take half our squadron. So we really had a ton of training to do and not a lot of time to do it. But we were able to get everyone on board, and the entire squadron really morphed rapidly to do that. At the same time, we got a new commanding officer as I was checking in, who had also been part of the unit as a major, a few years prior. So it was like we kind of put the band back together, or at least a few core people from it, and we were able to get it right back on track, which is really neat to see.
That's great. You talk about this story where you were getting ready to deploy on the USS Boxer, and your CO came out of the hangar to give a speech and made the comment that some of the members of the squadron might not be coming home. And you commented that it was a terrible time and place for that speech. I'm curious if you can put yourself back into the seat of a squadron commander.
Yeah.
What is the right thing to say? And why was that the wrong thing to say to a group of men and women who are going off to war for the first time?
Well, to me, it was a couple of things. The reason I didn't think that was the time or place was because for some reason, we got to the hangar, we're getting ready to go on buses to ride down to 32nd Street here in San Diego and get on the ship. But some family members had actually come into the hangar and were standing there and were going to watch us get on the buses and literally drive away. So he made that comment. And it wasn't that he said it to us as the Marines. The thing that bugged me about it was that there were wives and kids and other people in that room that I felt like they don't need to hear that, right? Like they're stressed out enough. Don't say that in front of them. Then we got on the bus, and I remember just quietly sitting there looking out the window and thinking to myself, but you know what? He's probably right. So it wasn't what he said. It was just who he said it in front of. And I distinctly remember this. And one of the things I always think about from my combat experience is you have to believe that it's not going to be you, but you also are very aware it's going to be somebody. Right. And that's this thing you're kind of constantly carrying around inside of you, and you never really reconcile it. It's just something you're aware of. It's interesting.
You talk about that a little bit in your book too, about the difficulty of reconciling the why not me or why was it this person. And anybody who's spent any time in combat will know exactly what it is that you deal with that sort of emotion. But I was successful in reconciling it by saying, okay, I don't know if it's about why this person and why not me. A lot of it has to do with luck. And then you talk about in your book how you went to see some therapy, and I did that too. And we could talk about that too.
Of course.
I had a really great experience with that too. So let's definitely come back to that. But I'll finish my thought out by saying, I came out of some sessions of talking about some things that bothered me and came away with the conclusion of, okay, a lot of that has to do with luck.
Yep.
Right. It has to do with luck and timing. But then I came up with this part too, which is sometimes luck is the residual of preparation and experience. And so it's not 100% about luck. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is that you can create your own luck, or you can increase the probability of being lucky if you combine experience and proper preparation. And when you were talking about that in your book, it really resonated with me too. And I'd love it if you wanted to talk for a second about, from a leadership perspective. I personally encourage people to go and talk to somebody if something's bothering them, because it's like this. I can sit around my backyard around the fire pit and I can talk to all my buddies about stuff. What's the difference? You're talking to somebody. However, that person is probably very well educated and qualified to ask really important questions to help you come to your own realization. That's what I took out of a lot of that.
Absolutely. And it was something that I thought about like over the course of my career. I just developed called an increasing awareness that the experience had an effect on me. And even though I felt fine, what I'd come to know is fine for me, and I was still functioning at a high level and enjoying what I was doing, I just knew like, hey, there's some stuff here I probably need to unpack and figure out just in case. And it was more, in my case, a seeking to understand myself as well as I could. But I also was very reluctant to do that until I was at a point where I was no longer flying, because I'd certainly come to believe that whatever it was that I had turned into was very effective in the aircraft, in the squadron, and gave myself and the other Marines that I was, cared so much about the best chance of literally surviving the experience. And so I didn't want to tweak that formula until I was at the end of that road. But as soon as I was at the end of that road, I definitely went and and started some counseling and really just came at it from a perspective of, hey, I think fine, but I've had all these crazy experiences, and I want to unpack that in a way that's smart and help me understand myself so I can, be the best version of myself going forward. And it was certainly one of the best decisions I ever made for myself.
Yeah, I'm sure the book helped too.
It did. Yeah, it was therapeutic, if you will, to write that. Absolutely.
Yeah, again, I enjoyed reading it. So another interesting story that I wanted to ask some follow-up questions on too. I hate asking questions that can be answered in the book. So I always phrase these as follow-up questions, but you had a commanding officer who was relieved while you were a student at WTI.
Yep.
And then you said an officer came down from the wing and addressed the whole squadron and said the behavior of the whole squadron was a disgrace.
Yep.
Is there a story behind that you could quickly orient listeners to? But then my real question is, what would you have said if you came down as the wing commander in that situation to the squadron?
Yeah, it was it was a tough situation for the unit, and it's a situation no unit wants to be in, obviously. But the truth is, like, what the officer that came down from the wing said, he wasn't wrong. I mean, we had screwed up as a squadron, and there was a reason that the CO got relieved, and it was one of those cases where it was, basically tied back to Liberty incidents and things that were condoned that probably shouldn't have been condoned, and in a place where we weren't supposed to be doing those things. And so it was fair. It was fair that it played out the way it did, and the comments that were made to us were fair as well. I think it's, no unit wants to be told like, hey, you guys are screwed up. And it was interesting because we had just finished our second deployment to Iraq, and we're getting ready to gear up and go right back for a third. So in terms of the whole unit, I think it ended up being like a very good lesson learned. It certainly was for me, of seeing that, like, hey, you get a little too far outside this box, and this is how it's going to get handled. And I think really and truly, interestingly, the whole unit ultimately got better as a result of that. Just kind of took our lumps there, and we went a few weeks before we got a new commanding officer because that wasn't planned. But we had a great XO at the time, and he stepped in and filled the gap until the new CO got there, and we were right back on, gearing up for the next deployment, training our butts off, and it all went well. But it was a great learning experience for sure.
That's great. I'd like to take the last few minutes to just talk about some of your experiences in transition, because invariably everybody listening to this is going to transition out at some time in their career out of the military. And you did it right at your 20-year mark, and you talk about that in your book. But I'm wondering if now that you've successfully retired, do you look back on the last 12 months that you were in uniform, and do you wish that you had done something different? In addition, do you have any advice for leaders who they themselves are a year away from getting out? Or what do you wish they had focused on 2 years before you got out? If it's even possible to think about it.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. And it's something I talk about quite often. I get a fair number of requests from other, Marines and military people who are transitioning and looking for some advice, because I had a somewhat non-standard transition in that I decided to go after something that is somewhat unusual, in that I wanted to transition into the business community, really totally separated from anything military, where, most of my peers are either airline pilots or they work for Lockheed, Northrop, the usual suspects. And I understand why they do that and why they want to do that. But in my case, the thing that I did that really helped me the most was I did all call it the basic administrative pieces of transition pretty far in advance. I had a billet at the Pentagon before I took command, and I didn't have a lot of spare time, but in my spare time, I got my LinkedIn profile pretty much cleaned up, and some other just things I knew I needed to have. And at that point, I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but I knew when I was in command, I wasn't going to have time to do any of it. So I did a little early prep work there, and I actually reached out and talked to some officers that I knew had transitioned out around 20 years post 05 command, because I wanted to get their perspective as well. Because while you're in uniform, and I coined this term, and I say this with the most affection and respect, but a lot of senior officers, what I observed early as a captain is the advice they would give you career-wise often mirrored what they had done and what they had personally done. And I came up with a term for that. I called, "Look how great I turned out advice." And so
that's perfect.
I was always leery of that. So I wanted to talk to some officers who'd made different decisions that were no longer in uniform. And that kind of helped form my overall understanding of, say, option A, option B, stay in the Marine Corps and continue, or go ahead and transition, at 20. But I did that early prep work and that helped. But then my last year in uniform, I'd just given up command and I went up to the wing, and I had a very busy job at 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing. I was the deputy G3, so the assistant operations officer in layman's terms. It was a big job. It was a busy job, but I spent all of my spare time going to networking events, going to transition classes, setting up, having coffee with somebody, going to meet somebody for a beer. And I was really just in receive mode for the first few months of that. And then one day the light bulb clicked in my head and I realized I was looking for what I called a situation, not a job. Because when you're coming out of the Marine Corps, it's very overwhelming, right? Because for the first time in your life, you can literally do anything. Where up until that point, someone's been telling you when you're going, where you're going, and when you need to be there, and actually moving all of your junk for you to help you get there quickly and efficiently.
Yeah.
So that initial look of scrolling through job postings is overwhelming. But the situation I defined for myself was small to medium-sized company that's trying to grow, preferably that has a lot of issues they're trying to fix in the people and process realms, because those are things I felt like I inherently just understood and knew that I'd maybe not mastered, but developed a very good skill set for in the Marine Corps. So I could help with those things immediately while I was learning the business. And once I had kind of defined that situation for myself, the whole process got easier. It helped me focus my networking on companies that look like that, situations that look like that. And I ultimately networked my way into one. So my first job out of the Marine Corps was the chief operating officer of a chemical manufacturing company. And I didn't know a damn thing about chemical manufacturing, but I understood people and I understood process. And I went into it thinking to myself, there's no way this is anywhere near as complicated as aviation maintenance. And I was correct. So I was able to immediately, go back to what I was talking about a little while ago with the KISS principle, keeping it simple. Hey, how do we make this simpler? How do we streamline it? How do we get more efficient? And most importantly, how do we take care of and lead these people? I was able to have a very positive impact right away. And that was a great experience. Parlayed that into starting my own little consulting company to help other small to medium-sized companies do the same thing. And then I ultimately got recruited by an owner CEO to help him grow his company. And, that's where I still am today. And when I started with him, we had 11 businesses scattered across San Diego with about 250 employees. And today we have 24 and almost 600 employees. And so that's been fun to be part of that project and just really build that people and process and all that stuff kind of from the ground up for the next phase of growth. And I've really enjoyed helping these businesses grow. It's been rewarding.
Yeah, that's awesome. What was your biggest negative surprise about becoming a civilian and reconciling that against your career? Were there any like, oh geez, I never really expected that to be something. I was after 20 years in the Marine Corps, I wasn't prepared for this.
I had one big miss, and I share this with everybody. And I actually am fortunate. I get asked to come. I still live in San Diego, and I go speak to some of the transition classes, both for the Marine Corps and the Navy here. But I share this with everybody. My primary miss was I should have really worked better with my spouse because she should have been transitioning with me. And that was something that both she and I missed. And I don't think either of us thought about it enough because we were in San Diego, we were staying in San Diego, and it was easy to assume that things wouldn't really change for her other than I would have a different occupation. But coming out of the Marine Corps, I don't think we thought enough about, your built-in friends, your built-in social life, all those things evaporate almost very quickly because my peers that stayed in the Marine Corps, they took orders, they went to top level school, they continued on, they moved away. And so you wake up one day, 3 years later, and I'm a few years down this track I'm on in a completely new world and a new career doing this thing. And in her case, our kids are older. Her life changed a lot. And I don't think we didn't think about that enough in advance. And then that became something that was a bit of a challenge for us to work through to help her try to catch back up, if you will, on her own path.
How about the VA? Any advice or experiences to share there for transitioning people?
For sure. I think the most important thing about the VA is just to dive into it and do everything you can do and need to do to get in the system before you actually exit the Marine Corps. And it's kind of a pain, obviously, and there's a lot to learn there. But going through the process and getting into the system is really the hardest part. Once you're in, it's not too difficult to navigate. I've actually had a very positive experience overall with all things VA, and that's been good. But I think it's really just take the time and put in the work up front to do it, because trying to do it later, what I've seen, definitely seen people do that. It's really hard once you're separated. It's a clean handoff if you start it early, and it's really pretty easy to do.
That's been the advice that I've heard over and over again. And I'll throw in my quick plug for anybody listening to this that's in the reserve system. If you're a reservist and you're going to retire out of the reserves, you have to remember you do not get a DD 214 out of the reserves. And the only proof of service connected disabilities is your medical records. So you have to have those things. They do not understand the DD 214. Why don't you have a DD 214? It's very difficult for them to understand. You got to have that paperwork. Anyway, that's my quick commercial for the reservists who are getting out. Wrapping up here, if you were to take a holistic view of your entire 20-year career and say, I've got one or two pieces of advice to share with people, what would those one or two things be?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say I have two of them. The first one is, and I observed this over and over again throughout the course of my career, the Marines that tend to do very well and be very successful are just always there. And the way I don't mean physically, literally always at the unit, but they just always happen to be around. They're jumping in to help with everything that's going on. They're throwing their hand up to volunteer to go on every det. Hey, if we need to get something done, they're right in the thick of it. And they just happen to always be there. And those Marines, as I observed over time, tend to really thrive, not just personally, but for the whole unit. And they tend to be the Marines that everyone else looks up to. And so I was always trying to be one of those, volunteer for, hey, we need someone to take this aircraft to North Carolina. I was the first one to throw my hands up and say, sure, I'll fly that cross country. Or, yeah, you need someone else to go on this det, I'm happy to do it. Or you need me coming on Saturday to test an aircraft, no problem. There's a little bit of a slippery slope there for your personal life. But I think it was those Marines that were just willing and worked their butts off and were always in the middle of it, tended to do really well. So that is definitely a path. The second thing I would share is something that fortunately I started doing when I was at officer candidate school and kept doing throughout my career, was keeping a journal. And it was kind of a goofy thing to do, if you will. And I certainly had several people give me a hard time about it over the years. But I was very thankful after the fact that I had done that, because there were so many things that I'd experienced and seen and got to be part of. I would have never, ever been able to remember it, not even close to way I was able to recount it, because I'd written it down. So having written it down was an awesome thing for me. And really what made me writing a book possible was because I had all the information there, and I could just go back through that journal and data mine it and put it into a hopefully coherent story to share with people.
Yeah. So why don't we conclude with you telling us, the listeners, a little bit more about the book, where they can find it. I will do the lead in by this. There are some awesome stories in that book, some harrowing descriptions of flights that you did that I think I was bare knuckle holding the book. They're described so perfectly that I could almost imagine myself being in the cockpit. It's such a great book. I really, really enjoyed it. But tell people where they can get it. Maybe a little bit up to, like, I don't know, did you start with a blinking cursor on a blank Word document? Like, what'd you do to do that?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. Well, I would say it's easy to find. It's on Amazon, barnesandnoble.com, your standard websites, both paperback and hardback version. I also have a website that's isaacglee.com, and there's links there to where you can buy the book. There's also links there to all my different social media where you can learn more about the book and the story and where it came from. But yeah, I really, I had that journal. I've been out of the Marine Corps for a few years, and I really hadn't thought about it a whole lot for a few years. And it was just like this sequence of events that kind of inspired me to sit down and share this story. And I had multiple reasons to do that. And one of them, of course, was just no one had written a book about what the CH-53 community had done in OIF and OEF yet. And so I felt like, a sense of obligation, if you will, to try to capture some of that history, albeit through my own lens. And then just, I felt like it was important to share a holistic view of the experience of being that, that Marine, that combat aviator, and living on what I like to refer to as two different planets, where on one, you're this Marine and you're going and doing these things and deploying to combat. And at the same time, you're supposed to be a husband and a dad and try to act like a halfway sane, normal human being when you're home. And that was a really hard thing to do at times. And I felt like it was important to share that aspect of the experience with people as well. And so kind of the cumulative thought of all of that really prompted me to sit down and share that story. But really, I went back through my journal, built a very comprehensive outline. And my advice to anyone who's writing a book is the outline has to be great for the book to have a chance of being okay. If you don't have an outline going in, you're just probably going to sit there and write for 10 years and no one's ever going to be able to decipher it. But I just went back through the journal, built a super detailed outline. And then once I was comfortable with that, and I'll tell you that outline was like 25 pages long, then I was able to sit down and start fleshing out the chapters one at a time. And it took me a year to write the first draft of the book because I was doing it all at nights, weekends, my spare time. But once I had that, then I felt pretty good about it. Had to send it to the Pentagon to get, clearance approval and, settled with the publisher. And once I got it back from the Pentagon, we were off to the races. So very cool experience.
Did the Pentagon come back with a lot of redactions or was it pretty clean?
They had some. It was mostly details, nothing that materially affected the stories. I was fortunate in that, in my experience, we worked with a lot of secret units, task forces that have been formed for specific reasons. And they made me or asked me to make how I talked about them a little more generic, which was fine. It didn't materially affect the story, but it was interesting to see some of the detail they asked me to remove. And there were certainly a couple things where I was like, well, anybody could Google that, but okay.
Yeah, right.
I did
Exactly.
what they asked. Yeah.
Well, I noticed there was a chapter missing in there about your fact tour, but
yeah, that is the one thing I wish I had gotten to do a ground tour, but just the way it worked out for me, I was so busy, flying and getting qualifications, and then went straight to the weapons and tactics school. I never really had time to work that in, but
yeah. Well, that's great. So Whiskey, thanks so much for being on the pod. Really appreciate it. Such great stories. I'll have links to the book and the website and all of that in the show notes, but go out and grab a copy